In visual communication, if we don't have context, we don't have meaning. And we need to understand context. I'm hoping, since this is an upper division class, that you have some background in context. You do if you've taken interpersonal communication from me. But I'm going to do a little bit of a review, a little bit of a primer here in terms of context, because it's critical that you understand what we're talking about here, and because I'll be using this throughout the course and talking about other theory and designers and visual communication and nonverbal communication as well. So we'll be talking about 5 different types of context: physical, psychological, social, cultural, and temporal here. Let me go through all 5 of these with you, and we'll sum this up and make an application at the end of this presentation. So let's start with the physical context. Our visual communication happens in physical contexts, in what we can see, the data that we draw in with our eyes. And that's pretty sophisticated stuff when it comes to light and color and line and shadow and all kinds of things that come into play that go through and tweak our perceptions of what it is that we're seeing. And that physical context will change depending on the environment that we're in, or depending on the social or cultural contexts that physical context has been constructed in. So let's use religious edifices for an example here. Here's the interior of a Catholic cathedral. The physical context of this. And this is set up for a very specific and unique objective, and that is to go through and diminish the person and aggrandize the deity. Okay, they're built so large, so big to go through and make you, when you walk into the cathedral, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. You feel in your place. You're diminished there to see the grand expanses and all the upward vectors that are happening within the architecture of that. Compare that to, say, this. This is the interior of an LDS chapel, and it's set up specifically in this physical context to go through and provide a way for people to face each other, a way for communication to be facilitated with that. Or how about this one? This is a synagogue in Las Vegas, Nevada. I've had a chance to go through and visit here and attend. And it's also set up for that same type of exchange, but it facilitates different parts of the ritual of worship or of gathering together here. And you see the circular design of this. So members of the congregation are facing each other. Or how about this one? This is a mosque, and as you'll see, there's, as you can notice here, there are no places to sit, because you do not sit in a mosque. When the prayers are offered, they're done on the knees and prostrating that way in that environment. And so that environment is specifically physically set up to go through and meet those cultural specific needs that we have go on. All of these do here. And so while these are religious contexts in terms of the physical context, they are designed to go through and meet different demands of what the cultural and the social context brings to that. You've been to restaurants. Here's Chili's. It's set up specifically to go through and physically to first off give you a place to sit, a place to wait, a place to have your dinner. But it's also set up to go through and get you out of that table relatively quickly as well, with the music and the other ambience that's going on around there. The devices that are on the tables themselves, in order for you to pay for your order and get out of there a little bit more quickly, turns their tables. You're able to get more people in and make more money as a result of that. So that physical context is set up in tune with the temporal context to go through and get people in, have them have hopefully a satisfying experience, and then get them out. Fast food restaurants are getting into the whole physical context change even more so, with different textures and colors, getting away from the 70s, 80s, and 90s concepts of what fast food was, and now trying to have that physical context go through and bleed over into maybe what the food is doing there as well. So that's it's for the physical context from a visual communication standpoint. Helps us establish the other context that might be happening within that realm. Look inside this home. Most homes, at least in my house, the center of the home is the kitchen. Okay, it's the hearth. It's a place where conversation happens. Nobody brings their technology into the kitchen. We are gathered around a place to eat or a place to cook and make food, and we have that exchange. We have the interchange, and the physical context for our home goes through and allows for that. You might be in a dorm room. The physical context of that dorm room is set there for specific purposes, for you to hopefully get some sleep at some point, for you to study, certainly, and for you to have some level of distraction, some kind of balance of all three of those things going on. So we have to recognize a physical context for what it does, that it establishes a place for the other contexts to happen. Okay. Next in our list then is the psychological context. And here's where really one of the main effects of communication happens, one of the main effects of visual communication happens. And that's on two different levels. That's affectively, emotionally, how we respond to things, and then cognitively, okay? Psychologically, how we learn things, how we pull things together. And that psychological context is tricky because we don't know how that is always going to come about. We might have a different response to somebody who might be dressed a little bit differently than we are based on experience what we've had with people like them before. We could talk all semester long just about the psychological consequences, the affective and the cognitive consequences of visual communication. We'll tie that together a little bit. We're going to get more into design than we are into the psychological context, but nonetheless, design has an impact on us psychologically to get to the third effect of communication, which is that psychomotor effect. It gets us to do something, to buy something, or to taste something, or to go somewhere, to do something along that line. So we'll touch upon this concept of the psychological context as well. Designers have to keep that in mind while they are pulling together the elements of design to create their artifacts. If you don't consider how the audience is going to respond, and we do that through communication objectives psychologically, you really have no business getting involved in design until you've gotten that figured out. Now, I have a psychological context based on many things in my life, but right now what's paramount in my mind is a psychological context of this person. She's my daughter, and she is going into basic training. She's going into the military. She's a 35 Mike going into military intelligence, and she will be studying Korean to be deployed. And so in the back of my mind, there's this psychological context, a psychological noise, because when I see images like this, it makes me very nervous for her and for her future. The other person is this guy. He's my son. As you can see, he's in law enforcement. And in law enforcement, there are inherent risks that he's taking. And we've been deluged with visual communication in terms of what's happening in law enforcement, from officer-involved shootings to officer shootings as well. So when I see something like this, you better believe that my psychological context goes off in areas that I don't want to get into that way. So it's pretty tricky in terms of what that's doing to us, but we need to understand contextually, combined with the other context, what the psychological context does to us, okay? Especially in terms of Gestalt, which we'll talk about in another video, how we perceive things and how they come together and how all those parts transcend the sum of the whole of those parts. The next context is this one. It's the social context. And this has to do with two different levels. It deals with the relationships that we have, the roles that we play within those relationships, and then it deals with the rules that we have, the social rules for those relationships as well. So what roles do I play? Well, I'm a husband, okay? And this is my companion. We've been together for about going on 12 years. And I bring to this relationship certain things that nobody else could, and she brings things to our relationship that nobody else could that way as well. When I see her, I have a visual communication response that's specific to her. Okay, and not just the way her face is shaped or the distance between her eyes or just that lovely smile. This all comes together and affects me because of that social role that we have as companions here. Now I play another role. I'm a dad. I just introduced you to my son and my daughter. And we have a different dyad or triad, a dyad relationship within this triad, different than what I have with my wife, obviously, right? Because they're my kids. And so there's a familial love. There is hopefully some mentoring back and forth with the both of us. There's a great friendship that exists here. And then I have this dynamic. I have stepkids within this marriage too. These three, along with their mom, my sweet companion. And there's a different set of rules and roles that go on with these guys than what happens with these guys. If you've been in a blended family, you know what I'm talking about. If I'm insensitive to that social context, to the roles that I play and the rules that are out there, we wouldn't be getting together. We wouldn't be getting along together, maybe I should say, and we get along well. I'm a friend. I'm a teacher and a mentor. I love adventure. I love to mountain bike. I'm a mountain biker. I host a television talk show. I'm a musician. I play the piano. I used to be a filmmaker and travel the world. And the bottom line, the first role I had was I'm a son and a brother within this family. So all of these roles come together. And with those roles, there are specific rules that come into play with them as well. As a designer, as I study visual communication, I have to recognize what is happening both relationally and in terms of the rules that are going on in order to make sense and in order to find meaning that way within that context. Next is the cultural context, and here's where it gets a little more sophisticated to understand, because the cultural context is broad in terms of how we interpret that. We might think of it geographically. Here I am with my other family. This is my Tongan family. As a filmmaker, I spent a number of weeks down in the kingdom of Tonga documenting Tongan culture that has to do with the laka laka. It's a type of Tongan dance, with the kava ceremony, and with other cultural icons that are quickly diminishing within the Tongan culture. And so my clients wanted to go through and help preserve what was happening here before it got to a point to where it was no longer going on. My film crew and I arrived the day after we got the assignment and knew nothing about the kingdom of Tonga or its people. And we're completely submerged in this culture that's just absolutely amazing, and on every level. And we made quick friends. We got involved with the food. We got involved with the rituals. We got involved with the kava, the laka laka, all kinds of things in order to get a greater understanding of that. So visually now I have a higher concept and understanding and finding meaning as to what might be happening there within the Tongan culture. Here at home we have Thanksgiving, a cultural thing. We have this turkey from a visual standpoint might make your mouth water in that respect. Food certainly is a huge cultural context. Here I'm in Brussels and I'm holding a real authentic Belgian waffle, which is completely different than what we're eating here in the United States. If you've been to Waffle Love or Bruges and Salt Lake, you kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about. But man, these are two different things. Or how about this? My daughter is running cattle here. She's doing a cattle drive. And this type of Western American culture has its own set of rules, has its own food, its own music. It brings together all kinds of things that are traditionally passed down from one generation to the next. Now, here we have a little bit of a mix going on because I'm pulling this horse trailer with our adventure vehicle, which is an entirely different subculture as well. It gets us out into the high desert, or it gets us out onto the lake, or onto Lake Powell, or into the ocean, or we go hiking. All these things become culturally significant because of the values, the beliefs, the mores that we draw from those experiences that end up making up our identity. visually, we have to understand that. We have to understand how those things work and how they come together, where people start to identify with those. This gets into persuasive theory as well, which I don't have time over the course of this semester to get into. Maybe you need to take persuasion from me too. Where we live is a cultural influence. Are we living together with a bunch of people in an apartment complex or a shared living area, or do we have the luxury of having our own space or big mansions and gates to lock out all the people that we don't want in there? Rituals make up a huge part of that cultural context. What we get into, the secret handshakes, if you will, or to certain icons that we might be wearing, the crucifix or even the CTR ring, all these things become part of that cultural context. What's our spiritual aspect? The spirituality becomes cultural to us. How do we manage our concept of afterlife, death and dying? Certainly has huge impacts in terms of visual communication. We end up going back to cemeteries and paying homage to a rectangle piece of cement with some words etched into it that now represent our deceased. That's a huge visual communication context as it goes. So all this comes together, really, and forms for us some type of cultural identity. And sometimes we resist it. Sometimes we have a crisis of faith. We want it to go away. Sometimes we are wealthy, and that overrides some of the other cultural aspects. It all comes together. And through that cultural journey, then we have different appeals to us visually. We respond differently along the way. Lastly, and you guys, you're getting the fire hose treatment on this in terms of context, is the temporal context. And this has to do with the passage of time. Okay, and that's really important. And in design, in visual communication, no less important, because time in seasons, for example, there's a whole different color palette that goes with fall than what goes with winter, than what goes with the spring. There's all this means something to us, and we all respond a little bit differently during these seasons. Okay, I find that I am more vibrant in the transitional seasons of fall and spring than I am in the dead of winter or in the heat of summer. I love this shot. These are my dogs, Marianne and Ginger. One of the most powerful temporal contexts I found myself in was this lantern festival. It was on a dry lake bed out in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And my spouse, that's her, and I went out to go through and participate in this, in something that was very personal to both of us. I'll just leave it there. But all the elements of this time came together in terms of the night, in terms of the clear sky, and then as the lanterns were released and the sky filled with these points of light, was very significant to us. So we need to understand how context works in relationship to what we're seeing, because that goes through and impacts us on how we feel, it impacts us in how we think, and it impacts us in the things that we do. So I've gone through this quickly. You might want to go back through this video and look at it again, stop it, write down some notes, and pick it up. Because when I say context, you need to know exactly what that means. All right, especially within, pun intended here, the context of learning about visual communication. If you have questions, you know where to find me.